Hello, Year 7. I hope you're all right. I hope you had a lovely half term. You got lots of rest and you're ready to come back and really hit the ground running for this final half term of the year. Obviously, it's a little bit tricky, I know, coming back to this remote learning business. But once a fortnight, I've sent you all the invites. We're going to do a Zoom lesson. I'm going to keep making you these videos, and hopefully, that is going to help with your work and help you kind of stay on top of things this half term. So, as you can probably see from the slide on the screen at the moment, we are learning about a new family of monarchs this half term, and you may recognise them. You might recognise this man, this rather large guy here. What about this lady, this ginger lady? You might recognise her. Do you know who they are? It's the Tudors. It's the Tudor family. Now, the Tudors are one of the most famous families of monarchs in English history. Everyone knows all about Henry VIII, his 6 wives, how fat he was, at least later in life. Elizabeth I, also very, very famous. His daughter, the Virgin Queen, defeated the Spanish Armada. We've also got Mary, sometimes called Bloody Mary. There's another Henry, there's an Edward, and they are probably, as I say, one of the most famous families in our history. So we're going to be learning a little bit about them this half term. Okay, but before we can do that, we need to know how they got to power. Because particularly, we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at Henry VIII, the most famous of the Tudors. And to understand what's going on in his head, you really need to be able to see what happened before. So today we are going to be learning about the situation that had been happening in England before the Tudors took power. So we're going to be joining the dots between Richard II, that 14-year-old king during the Peasants' Revolt, and the Tudors when they come to power sometime later. And that period of fighting between Richard II, the Peasants' Revolt, and the Tudors coming to power is called the Wars of the Roses, for reasons I will explain in just a moment. So, as I say, the Tudors very famous. Some of you may have visited Hampton Court Palace. Obviously, you probably won't be visiting it anytime soon, but it is a fantastic trip. If things open up again, I would really recommend it. Now, the thing about the Tudors that is relevant for us today is this. Okay, this is called the Tudor Rose. This was their sort of logo, if you like. It was their family symbol. And you'll notice it's made up of a red rose with a right rose in the middle. That is where our story is going to begin today. Because, as I say, the period of time that causes the Tudors to come to power is known as the Wars of the Roses. And the reason it's called that is because before the Tudors came to power, before they came to the throne with their red and white rose, there was conflict in England. There was two families fighting to be in power, and they were called the House of York. So the Yorkists, the York family, and their logo was a white rose, and the House of Lancaster, the Lancastrians, and their logo was a red rose. So you can see perhaps that the Tudor symbol is a mix of both, and you're going to understand why that is in the next couple of lessons. Okay, so that's why it's called the War of the Roses, because it is these two sides, both represented by a different coloured rose, fighting it out for power. And as I say, it was a good, nearly 50 to even more decades and decades of violence and death and chaos in England, as you can see from this lovely picture that I put on the screen now. So we're going to find out today what happened in the War of the Roses and how did the Tudors come to power off the back of it. Okay, now to understand that, we need to think of a key word, and I'm going to ask you to write this down, so you may need to pause the video in a second. Okay, but you may recognise this image here. Of course, these guys are the Avengers from the Marvel movies. I'm sure a lot of you will have watched those. Now, you will be aware that one of those Marvel movies, one of the Captain America ones, is called Civil War, and that can help us to understand what this word means. What happens in a civil war is when two groups that in theory are on the same side, go against one another. Okay, so for instance, in this case, the Avengers, they technically should all be on the same side, but Tony Stark and Captain America fell out, so they ended up having a civil war. They fought between themselves. And as you can see from this map of England, That's what happened in the Wars of the Roses. It was a civil war. English people fought English people between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Okay, so pause this, get that keyword down, okay, and we'll come to that shortly. Okay, now at this time, the thing is, this is what makes it more complicated. The reason it was a civil war is because Lancaster, the Red Rose, and York, the White Rose, they actually both came from the same family. They were members of the royal family, and that family's surname was Plantagenet. Okay, now the first Plantagenet, so the same way that my surname is Miss Quinlan, they are Mr. Plantagenet, it's just their surname. The first of those, the first Plantagenet king was Henry II, the guy we learnt about just before Christmas, who ended up murdering Becket. Okay, and all of his descendants, up until the Tudors took over, were of the Plantagenet family. Okay, as you can see here, there's Richard II, who is the king of the Peasants' Revolt. So you can see that the Lancasters and the Yorks were both from that same Plantagenet royal family. Okay, that's why it was a civil war. Don't worry, this all looks a bit complicated. You don't need to worry about any of this because we're going to talk about it in just a minute. But the key thing is that they both come from the same family, the Plantagenet family. So it's a civil war. Okay, the reason they were called York and Lancaster is because one side were the Dukes of York and one side were the Dukes of Lancaster. And these are the 6 kings that end up fighting each other over that period, okay, that we're going to find out about today. And so this period is called the Wars of the Roses. So what you're going to do, and you see which side was which just there, is you are going to listen to the story of the War of the Roses. You're going to find out about each of these kings and what they did and how they came to power. And as you do that, you have a copy here of the family tree. So if you haven't seen a family tree before, the way it works is you have the parent, and then coming out of the parent is their children. So the first king we look at is Edward III, and he had 5 sons. Okay, all right. What you're going to do is, basically you can kind of divide this into a bit like a boxing match. Okay, so we've got the red corner and we've got the white corner, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, and as they fight over this long period of time, it can basically be divided into rounds. Okay, so the first bit of the sheet in green is round 1, the second bit of the sheet in sort of pinky red is round 2, and then the final bit of the sheet in blue is round 3. So what you're going to do is you are going to watch the rest of this video. I'm going to talk you through each king. As you go, and the questions will come up in order, I want you to write answers in your book to each of these questions. Okay, so these are all your questions for round 1. Okay, and I'll tell you in the video what's round 1, what's round 2. So you answer those questions, you then move on and answer these questions. So make sure you get them in the right order so you can see which box you do. So A, B, C, D, E, F. All right, follow the numbering. Okay, and then that is going to help you to understand this quite complicated civil war. Okay, so you need to be answering in full sentences, please. Okay, so watch carefully. Obviously, you can pause, you can rewind as much as you need to, and you are going to need to pause a few times because there's a lot of information to take in. Okay, so make sure you've got this sheet in front of you. Make sure you're pausing, you're rewinding, you're writing those answers in as much detail as you can. Listen carefully. Let's hear the story of the Wars of the Roses. Okay, guys, let's start with round 1. So you need to be looking at the sheet that says round 1 for your questions.
So let's start with this chap, Edward III.
Now, we know a little bit about this guy because he was King of England during the Black Death, that massive pandemic we learnt about last lesson where huge numbers of people died. Now, obviously, because a lot of people died, it wasn't ideal, but with the exception of the Black Death, Edward III is actually a pretty decent king.
Under his reign, everything seemed comparatively rosy. Forgive the pun. And he had 5 sons, so peaceful succession was assured.
Now, what he means by that is that because Edward had 5 sons, there really was no worries about who would come after him, because he had a son, he had a couple of sons, he had an heir and a spare, several spares. So in theory, everything should have been fine. There was easily someone to succeed to the throne when he died.
But all did not quite go according to plan. Edward, the eldest son, aka the Black Prince.
Obviously, a very cool name, and the reason he's called the Black Prince is, well, we're not quite sure. Either it's because he wore black armour into battle, or it's because he actually had a really nasty reputation. He was a really cruel fighter and treated particularly the French very nastily, so they said he was black, like a black heart.
Whilst laying siege to a French town, he caught dysentery and
Dysentery, very nasty disease. It's basically an intestine problem, and essentially you poo yourself to death.
later died before his father. As a result, the throne passes to Edward's son Richard, who becomes Richard II. He was just a babe in arms at the time, well, 10 actually, but he had 3 uncles to look after him and run the country for him. And this is exactly what they did, especially the eldest of the uncles, John of Gaunt, aka the Duke of Lancaster.
So again, these are people we know, right? Richard II, he was the king during the Peasants' Revolt. If you remember, he was only 14 years old at the time. John of Lancaster, the Duke of Lancaster, he was his uncle, his advisor, who was basically running the country for him. And it was him that the peasants really hated. If you remember, when they were in London going mad, they actually went into the Duke of Lancaster's house and burnt it to the ground. So that just shows you how much John of Gaunt was hated.
However, as Richard got older, the more he resented his interfering relations. I want to be my own man and make my own decisions, he began to think. Trouble was, he wasn't actually much good at making decisions. When he banished his cousin Henry, John's son, now the Duke of Lancaster, to France and confiscated lands from him, enough was enough. So whilst Richard was away in Ireland, Henry slipped back into the country from France, rallied support from the nobles and barons, imprisoned Richard on his return, and took the crown for himself, becoming Henry IV. Cousin love for you. This, of course, set quite an important precedent.
Precedent. That's a weird word. Well, it's actually a legal word. It's the kind of word you might hear a lawyer using, for instance. What it basically means is an example that other people can follow. So, for instance, I have set the precedent this year that if you don't do your homework, you get an after-school detention. Right? That's a precedent. I've made it very clear that you can do this thing and this will happen. So what happened here is that Henry made it clear that if you've got the muscle, you can boot the king off the throne.
If you had enough muscle and backing and had the blood royal, then you too could claim the throne. As it happened, all went reasonably well for Henry. He didn't face any major challenges to his throne, and he even found time to build some nice buildings.
Okay, round 1 at the War of the Roses, done. Let's move on to round 2. So you need to switch to the next sheet.
Following Henry's death, we get Henry V, his son. He perfected the old trick of distracting attention at home while bashing the French some more. Once more until the breach, dear friends, once more, Agincourt and all that.
Now, if you haven't heard of Agincourt, essentially it's one of the most famous battles in English history, and it's where Henry V, so this king we're talking about here, he managed to beat the French, even though they outnumbered English nearly 2-1. We're talking about perhaps 6,000 to 9,000 English soldiers versus 15, potentially even 25,000 French, and we absolutely smashed them, even though we just had longbows and they had knights. Okay, so a really amazing victory, and it's partly why Henry V is remembered as a great king. In fact, he actually, just before he died, he managed to win France, and in theory his son would inherit it and become the next king after him.
So he survived and the throne passed to his son, another Henry VI. Oh dear, not cut from quite the same cloth as his father. Not only did he have a disastrous campaign in France, which his father had arranged for him to inherit as king of France, but he was subject to frequent bouts of melancholy, often taking to his bed for weeks at a time.
So, basically what happened was this new king, this new Henry, was completely useless. He lost almost all their land in France. If you remember, when he actually became king, he in theory had become king of France as well, but he lost all of that, lost all of his father's achievements, and he also had a really serious mental illness. Now, we don't know exactly what this was, but what happened, as you've just heard, is there's a few times in his reign when he just completely had a mental breakdown. He was unable to move, unable to talk, he didn't respond to anything. Even the birth of his new son. He just wouldn't speak or move or respond in any way. And he just lay in his bed for almost a whole year refusing to speak to anybody or move or even so much as acknowledge other human beings. So he really did. It's potentially possible that something called schizophrenia, but he certainly had quite a serious problem, and unfortunately, that meant that problems started in England. So it's at this point that the Wars of the Roses really start to kick off. And before we get into that, let's just think about why they're called the Wars of the Roses. So these three kings we've just learnt about, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, those three Henrys, if you remember, they were all descended from John of Gaunt, and he was Duke of Lancaster, which is why they're called Lancastrians. They're called the Dukes of Lancaster, the House of Lancaster, and their symbol was a red rose.
And the powerful at court soon began to lose faith in his ability to rule, and so began another power struggle.
So, the descendants from the Duke of Lancaster are the Lancastrians, and now let's find out who the other rose are. It's the Yorkists, and they are descended from the other son of Edward III, Edmund, and Edmund was Duke of York. So they are called the Yorkists, the House of York, and their symbol was a white rose. So there you have it. That's why it's called the Wars of the Roses, because it's the red rose of Lancaster versus the white rose of York. Both of whom have royal blood, but they both can't decide who is the rightful heir to the throne.
In particular, descendants from Edward III's fifth son, the Duke of York, thought that they could do a better job at running the country than Henry and his Lancastrian supporters. Eventually, the whole thing erupted in war. Both sides won victories and suffered defeats, and families and key players changed sides as the conflict continued and the balance of power shifted back and forth. Finally, in 1461, the Yorkists seized the throne and Edward IV was crowned king, deposing Henry. All seemed settled until some 10 years later, when a group of powerful nobles got fed up with Edward. So they switched sides, put Henry back on the throne, and Edward fled abroad. But then Henry became incapacitated again.
So, just to be clear, Yorkists took the throne, Lancastrians under Henry VI took it back, but then he went mad again, so guess what happened?
Edward returns, wins a thumping victory at Tewkesbury in 1471 and takes the throne back. But things are not quite over yet. When Edward dies in 1483, his son and heir Edward V is just 12 years old. And before he can be crowned by his mother and her supporters, his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, places him and his brother, the princes, in the Tower of London for their own protection. The young Edward, as we shall see later, is then discredited, and the crown passes to his uncle, who becomes Richard III.
Okay, Richard III, not a nice guy. Alright, there's a picture of him. Now, the reason there's a car park in the background is because not that long ago, as you can see here, Richard's skeleton was actually dug up in a car park. Alright, well, what is now a car park? It had previously been a church, but his body had been thought to be lost because of what happens to him, as you'll find out. But he was, just a few years ago, excavated under what is now a car park, and as you can see from his skeleton, he famously had a hunchback. He had a crooked spine. Now, Richard was not a nice man, alright? He was a Yorkist king. As you can see, he basically came to the throne by putting his little nephew in the Tower of London, a horrible prison at the time. Now, there's a good chance that he probably had him murdered, because that little boy and his little brother, the two princes in the tower, they never came out again. They were never seen again. And in fact, some years later, their skeletons, or what was thought to be their skeletons, were discovered under some stairs in the Tower of London. So Richard, not a nice guy. Alright, and that is how he came to power as the final Yorkist king in the War of the Roses.
But Richard cannot hold on to power. A number of his key supporters switch sides and join a swelling tide of support for Henry Tudor, the new Lancastrian favourite.
That's right, there's one Lancastrian left. We thought they were all dead, but there is one still out there, and his name is Henry Tudor. And he's going to become the first Tudor king, and we'll find out how next lesson.